Good. Okay, so here we are. So we're going to talk today about operant conditioning. I'm mostly wanting to talk about this because I think there's a huge misunderstanding between negative reinforcement and positive punishment. And I think that it's very important that we as horse riders and horse trainers understand the difference, because it is really relevant to when you release pressure and that sort of thing, to understand what you're doing. So you can see the first row is reinforcement and the second row is punishment. So we can talk about positive and negative in both of those things. So if we look at reinforcement, we're looking at either increasing or maintaining a behavior. And this is the motivation of the trainer. We'll call them trainer, might be trainer, rider, handler, whatever it is. So if we're reinforcing, we want to increase the behavior or we want to maintain it. So we like it. So we can use positive reinforcement. And to use positive reinforcement, it means we have to add something. Okay. Negative reinforcement means we take something away. And it works the same with punishment, except for punishment, we're looking to decrease a behavior. So it's a behavior we don't want. We can add something with positive punishment, or we can remove something, being negative punishment. So the negative and positive simply mean add or remove. That's all. It's not a good thing or a bad thing necessarily. It's just add or remove. And we've tried at various times to make it addition and subtraction, but people don't like to change the way they use it. And I think negative reinforcement gets a bad rap because of the word negative. So, we need to think beyond the word that's used. So right here, we can see, so with these ones, we want more of this. So we're trying to increase or maintain a behavior by reinforcing it. With punishment, we want less of this. So we want to decrease that behavior by punishing it, whether we do that by adding something or removing something. So let's have a bit of a look at what those somethings might be. So with reinforcement, if we're using positive reinforcement, we have to add something that the horse wants. So it could be food, it could be a scratch, it could be companionship, it could be a soft word. Those are examples. There are other things. If we're using negative reinforcement, we have to remove something that the horse doesn't want. So that might be leg pressure. It might be rein pressure, or even the lead rope if you're leading the horse. It might be your voice. If, say, you're clucking to the horse to go forward or to go faster or something, you might stop using your voice. That too is a pressure cue. Or it might be your physical proximity. And, if you've ever worked with a horse that hasn't got much handling or is very afraid, the closer you get to the horse, the further it moves from you. So physical proximity is an important one. So with punishment, we need to add something for positive punishment. So we might add the whip. Or so slap the horse with the whip if it does something wrong. So we want to decrease that behavior. If the horse is pulling on us, we might pull back on the lead rein. We might shout at the horse or blow a raspberry at the horse. That's adding something. It's adding a pressure. We might smack the horse, hit the horse. Again, all these things, we need to add these things because that is positive punishment. So with negative punishment, it's less used in horsemanship, but sadly it still is. But we have to remove something that the horse wants. So what does the horse want? Well, the horse might want attention from us. The horse might enjoy the attention, so we might take that away. We might withdraw a food reward. So let's say we're training the horse with food and the horse doesn't do it. We might take the food away from the horse. We might leave the horse alone, and you see that quite a bit. You tie the horse to the tree of knowledge or something like that, where you take away its companionship with its bird mates. And I've also heard of people withdrawing food or water from the horse to punish it for doing something wrong. So there's a big problem, particularly here, I think. Up here, if your timing is bad, let's say the horse bites you, and you don't smack the horse immediately, the horse has to know what it did wrong, and it might not know what it was that you're now hitting it with. So that can be a really bad thing, and it just is a positive punishment that the horse doesn't understand. So that can lead to all sorts of behaviours that are quite difficult to deal with. And the same with the removal of things. So you're making the assumption that the horse knows what it did wrong. So, let's think the horse does a bad jumping around, or the horse bucks you off or something. So you go and tie it up to a tree for 3 hours. The horse is unlikely to know what it did wrong. And beyond 5 minutes of being tied to the tree is also more likely to develop all sorts of behaviors that you don't want it to have, such as pawing. So it's a very punishment in general is quite difficult. But when we look back here, we want less of these things that we're punishing. So looking at our motivation for doing either reinforcement or punishment is the easiest way to tell what you're using. So if I think I don't want the horse doing that, and I do something, I'm probably using punishment. And so I think the important thing to remember is that this one, punishment, is less predictable for the horse, and it's also being, on our part, very reactive. So I'm reacting to how the horse behaved. Whereas if we try and stick with the reinforcement, we're being more proactive. So we're reinforcing behaviors that we want. And I'd rather try and stick with reinforcement so that we're reinforcing those behaviors we want rather than reacting to those that we don't want. So if we come down here and we look at what quadrant might be used. So I've just got a few examples here which we'll have a look at. And so applying leg pressure to walk forward and removing it when the horse walks forward. So there we've got pressure and release. The pressure and release, we're trying to encourage the horse to do a behavior, which might be walk forward here. And then we're using pressure release, which is negative reinforcement, to get the horse to do that. So the first example is negative reinforcement. The second one, tying the horse to the tree of knowledge. So the horse is in some sort of misdemeanor, and we are removing the horse from its herd mates or from company. So it's negative because we're removing, and it's punishment because we're trying to decrease that behavior from happening in the future. So applying a verbal cue to ask for trot and being quiet when the horse trots. So that might be like that. As soon as the horse trots, we're quiet. So the verbal cue, the clucking noise, is pressure, and the release is being quiet. So that's pressure release. That's negative reinforcement. Removing the horse's food, water, or friends. Again, we're removing something. It's punishment. We're taking it away because those are the things that the horse wants. So the horse has done something wrong. So scratching the horse on the wither when it does a flying change, a clean flying change. So we're adding something. We're adding the scratching, and we're trying to encourage that behavior. We like the clean flying change. So we're adding something and we're increasing the behavior. So we're here at positive reinforcement. So giving the horse a treat when it lowers its head, again, we're adding something, we're giving it a treat, and the horse has done something we want it to do. So we're back to positive reinforcement. And just notice with these two, they're both positive reinforcement. They don't necessarily involve food. There seems to be some confusion that positive reinforcement always involves food, and it doesn't always involve food at all. Lots of things the horse wants, lots of things the horse makes the horse feel good, and we can use them all as positive reinforcement. So tapping the horse with the whip when it's pawing the ground. So this is an interesting one because we often think incorrectly of pressure and or pressure release or negative reinforcement and punishment as a sort of a scale. Like you're moving from smacking the horse to that, and that might be a really high on the scale, like a bad thing, to tapping the horse with the whip. And if you're only tapping the horse, well, it must be negative reinforcement. But it has nothing to do with the severity of what you're doing. The definition of this is your intention. So like you might be tapping the horse very lightly with the whip when it's pawing the ground, to discourage it from pouring, but your intention still is to make that behavior less likely to happen in the future. So it's really irrelevant how hard you're hitting the horse. The relevance is what your intention is. So if your intention is to make that behavior less likely to happen in the future, then it's positive punishment. So we're adding the tapping, and because we don't want the horse to be pawing the ground. And for me, we might have very different definitions of what tapping the horse is. For me, it might be barely touching it with a dressage whip, and for someone else, it might be, hitting it over the cannon bone with a 2x4. So rather than trying to work out, what constitutes punishment, it's much easier if we actually just see how that fits in with the learning theory and with the definitions of the quadrant. We're trying to make it less likely to face punishment, no matter how severe we consider the thing to be. So we're going to have a quick look at dogs. So asking your dog to stop walking forward on the lead with a light touch, and that obviously is the light touch is then released, that's negative reinforcement. And I put the dog one in there simply because, we quite often find, particularly with dog training, is that they classify all negative reinforcement as punishment. They put it all into this aversive training methods thing, and there isn't much understanding about it. So if you're putting a collar and lead on your dog, you're using negative reinforcement. So it's important that you're aware that you're using negative reinforcement, simply because otherwise your release might not be timely. So moving on. So we've been through this really, the reinforcement. Either we want to add something pleasant to increase or maintain, or take away something and to decrease the behavior. And then the same with negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, so we remove the stimulus, and negative punishment, we remove the stimulus that the horse wants. So we really do want to try and stick to this reinforcement area, positive and negative. And so what we do is we really use combined reinforcement. And it's very hard just to use one or the other. So let's have a little think about that. And you do hear this quite a lot, they only use positive reinforcement. And it's a lovely idea, but it's problematic, because anyone that puts a head collar on a horse, leads the horse with a head collar, let alone rides the horse, is using negative reinforcement. You can't help it. As soon as I put a head collar on the horse and pick up any pressure on that lead rope, I'm using negative reinforcement. So it's always a combination of both, pretty much. So if you think about when you ride your horse, if you ask your horse to canter, for example, you might have a verbal cue. I particularly have a kiss for canter, and you might have a leg cue as well. So once your horse canters, you release those. So that's the pressure release. So you stop kissing to the horse. That verbal cue is a pressure. You stop doing that, and you remove your leg pressure as well. So both those things, pressure release, that's the negative reinforcement part. But then invariably, we also say good boy, good girl, and we give the horse a scratch on the wither or something like that. We always add the positive reinforcement. So, you've got to think these lines are slightly blurred, and I think it's almost impossible to use simply one or the other. So it's a combination of both. So combined reinforcement. Give me an example of only using positive reinforcement. So let's say we want to teach the horse to stand on a pedestal. And the pedestal's in the middle of the arena. If we only use positive reinforcement, we basically have to wait till the horse decides to go into the arena, and then we can reward it. And then we have to wait for the horse to decide that it wants to stand up on the pedestal, and then we can reward it. And that's really quite silly, because the horse is probably never going to want to stand on the pedestal. What we actually do is we put a head collar on the horse or a bridle on the horse, and we take it towards the pedestal, and we encourage it to step on the pedestal. So that's a negative reinforcement. And then we reward it for doing that. So we might use food treats, we might use some other thing, but we're using combined reinforcement. Because the reason we're doing that, and the reason we know we're doing that, is because a negative reinforcement gives direction. So that tells the horse where we want the horse to go. It tells the horse, let's say we're teaching the horse to pier. So, and you'll see liberty trainers doing pier, and the horse is piafing on the spot, and people look at that and go, "Oh, isn't that lovely? It was taught to piaf with no bridle and just standing in the paddock." But if you think about that, if it was taught that just using positive reinforcement, we'd have to hold the carrot up. We'd have to wait for the horse to piaf, and then we'd reward it, because we have no way of telling the horse what we want. But if we use combined reinforcement, we can get the horse to trot. We can reward the horse for trotting. And then we can get the horse to have smaller steps, and we can reward the horse for taking smaller steps. And then we can eventually get the horse to show the horse what we want to do, take even shorter steps, and the horse is trotting more or less on the spot, and we reward that behavior. And so at the end, the horse learns that pattern. It learns that pattern by being directed with the negative reinforcement, with the pressure release on what we want. So if we're taking the horse to the pedestal, it might lift its foot in front of the pedestal and maybe just touch it and remove its foot again because we've been maybe tapping it with the whip or maybe clucking at it using that pressure release. And then we reward that. We reward the horse for touching the pedestal with its foot. That's the combined reinforcement. But without the negative reinforcement, part of that, it's very hard to tell the horse what it is we want. So you're just waiting for the horse to display the behavior that you want. And I think that the reason it's important that we understand this is because the negative reinforcement section of the combined reinforcement is both the pressure and the release. They come together. So the release is not the reward. The reward we must add. It's a separate thing. That is the positive reinforcement. So we've got to add that. And I think that's what we forget. We sort of think, oh, pressure release, so that's the reward. Same thing. No. The great thing about positive reinforcement and adding that is it really marks the behavior. So if I've asked the horse to step onto the pedestal and the horse goes, makes a little effort towards that and lifts its foot, maybe touches the pedestal with its foot, then I can immediately reward that with a scratch and maybe a treat or anything at all. And the horse goes, oh, that was the right thing. So yes, I've released pressure, but I've given that second signal saying, yes, that was exactly what I want. Good horse. And so it makes the behavior much, much easier, much easier to teach, and makes it much clearer for the horse. So that's the thing, it marks the correct behavior. But with the positive reinforcement, the big thing here is it must be timely. Okay, because let's go back to our example of teaching the horse to step on the pedestal. If I start rewarding the horse with food to step on the pedestal, and I miss the horse stepping, or I miss the horse making an effort, and quite often if we're not very familiar with the horse, or we don't understand, shaping very well, the horse makes a little effort and we might miss that. If the horse moves its weight forward, for example, rather than just steps on it, we might miss that. And then we're really withholding the food. So if a horse is expecting the food for making an effort and we don't reward it, we've then moved into positive punishment because we're withholding the food. Do you see what I mean? It becomes, the lines are blurred, and they depend on your getting your timing right, and they depend on your understanding of what it is you're trying to do. It's not really clean cut, but do be careful with thinking that because you're using food, it's always positive reinforcement, because you need to use food very carefully. And I think that's worth remembering. I also put there that the food, the positive reinforcement needs to be appropriate. And I've found, particularly with training, I've trained a lot of sort of rescue horses and highly anxious horses, and appropriate for me with those sorts of horses. What I find if I introduce food sometimes is it sort of throws them a bit. They go, "Whoa, hang on a minute! No, I'm not in the rest and digest mode. I'm still somewhere else," and their anxiety level is too high, and so it's quite confusing. Whereas they do seem to understand just the pressure release. They understand very well, and the positive reinforcement of rest or stroking or just something calming. So for some horses, food is not very calming. And so I think we need to be careful, make it appropriate, but I think it's more important to make it timely. So let's have a quick look at this. So which one is it? So plucking at your horse to keep it in trot. And we've all ridden a riding school horse, you know, that you either have to keep kicking or keep squeezing or keep clucking. And if you stop, the horse stops trotting. Is it negative reinforcement? No. It's positive punishment, isn't it? It's positive punishment. So in that situation, what you've done is you've made your horse really dull to the aids. So your signal might be to cluck to the horse, or your signal might be to squeeze the horse into trot. And so the horse is habituated to this amount of pressure constantly. So it's positive punishment, never goes away, doesn't matter what the horse does. And you do that because you know that as soon as you take your legs off or you stop clucking, the horse is going to fall back into walk. So what you need to do in that situation, because it's not going to improve on its own, is you need to resensitize the horse to the signal. You know? So the signal has become dull, the horse has become unresponsive to the signal, so we need to resensitize the horse. And that's something we can talk about here later, but that's what's happened. It's turned into positive punishment. So withholding a food treat when the behavior is correct, and again, we've discussed that, and that's a poor timing thing, and it's negative punishment. So often these two things are called negative reinforcement, but they're positive punishment, negative punishment. And it's just a mistake that people don't quite understand what it is they're talking about. So, and is it any different for our canine friends? And these are some of the things that are referred to as negative reinforcement in canine circles. So any sort of physical coercion, so pushing the dog to sit down, if you ask the dog to sit and then pushing its hindquarters down to force it to sit, is that negative reinforcement? No, it's positive punishment. Citrus sprays or, sonic devices, again, it's adding something to decrease a behavior. It's positive punishment. And the choke chains and electric collars, again, they're adding something to decrease the behavior. So the choke chain in particular, if you see people sort of pulling quickly on the choke chain, whereas you can use just a collar and lead as negative reinforcement, where you can pick up on it and release when the dog stops or slows or whatever it is you want to do. And if you see people with dogs, that's what they're doing all the time. They're using negative reinforcement when the dog is on the lead. But if you're adding jerks on the collar, the same as you would with the rein with the horse, it's positive punishment. So that is it for me, for the little discussion about the difference between negative and positive punishment and reinforcement. So